Hello students, I hope you all are good there. Welcome to your channel Zebish English Classes. Stay happy and stay safe. Today I have picked up this book Treasure Trove, which is from ICSE board for the students of 9th as well as 10th standard. And the poem that I have taken up today is the second poem, The Cold Within, that has been written by James Patrick Kinney. James Patrick Kinney is an Irish American poet who had written this poem in the 1960s. And that phase of 1960s had an African American civil rights movement at that point of time as a result of the concept of racism that was prevalent across the world at that point of time. And the poet got inspired to write such a poem which would portray you different grounds of discriminations that are prevalent in the world even till today. So, this is how you will be able to see that this poem is very much relevant even in the contemporary world. So, let us first of all analyze the title of the poem because whenever we study a piece of literature, it is important for us to analyze the title of that piece of literature because it helps us to understand that literature in a better way. So, here the title is saying The Cold Within. Now, what do we understand by this title, The Cold Within? First of all, this word cold here is standing as a pun, and pun is a figure of speech which simply means that a word that has got the same spelling, that has got the same pronunciation, but it carries two completely different meanings. For example, over here, the word cold carries completely two different meanings, such as one meaning is cold means when the temperature is low and it is cold, you feel cold, thund, which we call thund, right? That is called cold. Another meaning of the cold word over here is the feeling of negativity, the feeling of hatred, the feeling of harshness, unfriendliness, heartlessness, emotionlessness. So, here the word cold stands for both the types of meanings, for both the meanings that are completely different from each other. One meaning is related to the low temperature, another meaning is related to the negative emotions. Now, here, the poet has very beautifully portrayed it in this manner. He is showing you two types of cold. He has set the background of the poem in such a manner that you get to see that there is cold outside. That cold outside, which he's talking about, is in terms of the low temperature, and the cold that he's talking about inside, within, inside the hearts of the people, that cold stands for negativity, for hatred, for unfriendliness, harshness, and selfishness. So we have to understand now that the poet is saying the cold within, that means that cold inside the hearts of the people, that is in the form of negative emotions, that is negativity, selfishness, harshness, unfriendliness, and emotionlessness, and due to which humanity is suffering a lot. There occurs a lack of humanity in the society now. So, this is what the poem has been entitled, and now let us start the poem, and we will be able to understand how the poet is going to show you that there is cold outside in the form of low temperature that makes you feel cold, and then there is cold inside. This is how he has portrayed, and he has created it in the form of a story, and therefore the poem is called a ballet. Six humans trapped by happenstance in bleak and bitter cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, or so the story is told. So here you have to imagine, you have to see that there are six humans that have been trapped by chance in such a place where there is very cold. So, first of all, these six humans are actually metaphorically representing the six groups of people, or the class of people, or the types of groups that exist in the society. such as there is a class of rich people, there is a section of poor people, there used to be a class of black people. They were marginalized at that point of time, so there used to be a separate class of black people, then there used to be a group of white people. So this is how people are there in different groups or different classes, different sections. And these varieties of people that exist in a society are being represented metaphorically by six humans here, trapped by happenstance. That means they were trapped by chance. It happened that they got trapped in such a place where the temperature was very low and it was very cold, and that's why they were feeling very cold. In bleak and bitter cold, bleak is dull and bitter is very harsh. And since here we see that in one single line there are two words that begin with the same letter which pronounces consonant sound, and that's why this is a figure of a speech which is called alliteration. So here in this line, there is a figure of a speech called alliteration. Just because we see bleak and bitter. So bleak is starting with B and bitter is also starting with B. Both the two words that are in the same line have got the same first letter and they are giving the same consonant sounds, due to which it is called the figure of a speech alliteration. So, six human beings got trapped by chance in such a place where the temperature was very low and they were feeling very, very cold. Each one possessed a stick of wood, or so the story is told. And there, everybody had got a piece of wood, a log in their hands. This is how the story goes on. So, this much is clear to you, the entire setting of the poem, that there are six human beings that have got trapped at a place where the temperature is low, they are feeling very cold. But then there's something good, that they all have got a piece of wood in their hands. This is how the story is told or the story is narrated. So here it is a story, and that's why it is a ballet. So this was the first stanza. Now let us go ahead. Their dying fire in need of logs, but the first one held hers back, for of the faces round the fire she noticed one was black. So here you see that there was something good as well, that they all had got a fireplace in the center. The six human beings were sitting in a circle and there was a fireplace in the center. So as a result of that, they were able to keep warm, and this is how they could survive at that particular place where there was very, very cold and the temperature was so low. But the fire was about to die. We see that they're dying fire. Dying fire, that means the fire was dying. And here there is a figure of a speech called personification. Because we generally do not use the word die for fire. We say that the fire extinguishes. It does not die, it gets blown out. But we don't say that the fire dies. Die is a word that we use for human beings, for persons. And here, this word die has been used for fire. It means fire has been treated as a person, it has been personified. And therefore, we can say that there is a figure of speech used in this line which is called personification. So, dying fire, the fire is dying, and when the fire is dying, it needs more woods to keep itself alive. And there is something good, that all those six human beings who are sitting in a circle have got a piece of wood in their hands. Every one of them have got one log, with the help of which they could easily keep the fire alive. Now let's see what happens. But the first one held hers back. But the first lady who was sitting there, she simply held her, she was the first one. So it was her turn. She should have done that. She should have used her piece of wood to keep the fire alive. But then instead of giving her piece of wood, that stick which she had got in her hand, she held it back. No, I won't give. She was saying, I won't give. She held it back. For means because of the faces round the fire, and it was simply because she saw something, she noticed something, that in that circle of the people who were sitting there, there was a lady, there was somebody. Okay, not exactly it is mentioned that was a lady or a gentleman, but there was somebody, some person, some human being who was black in complexion. She noticed one was black, so she saw one face in that circle who was black. And as soon as she saw that there was one black person in the group, she decided not to give her log just because her log would help that black person as well. And she was so much into that concept of racism, she believed in it so much that she couldn't help somebody who was dark in skin color. So, on that ground, she discriminated and she refused to give her piece of wood, or you can say log. So, let me tell you one more thing, that in this stanza, the first line had the figure of speech of personification, and the second line again had the figure of speech called alliteration. Since I have already told you about alliteration, what is alliteration? That's why now it is your responsibility, whenever you find a line that has got that figure of speech, you should always find it out yourself. So here also you can see that H are there in two words. Two words begin with the first letter H, and that is a consonant sound. That's why it is alliteration. Then we say the same thing, alliteration, in the third line, where we see fire, faces, and for, faces, fire. So in the third line, we see there in the same line, there are three words that have got the same first letter, that is F. And F is a consonant sound letter. That is why it is called alliteration here also. So this is how we come to an end of the second stanza as well. In the second stanza, what the poet has tried to portray you is the discrimination on the ground of racism. How she denied to give just because there was somebody black in complexion. Now let us move on to the third stanza. The next man looking across the way saw one not of his church and could not bring himself to give the fire his stick of birch. So it came the turn of the next man now, and that next man looked across the way. That means he just looked around so as to find out who all are sitting there in that group. And then he found that there was somebody who did not belong to his church. That means he must not have the same opinions, same perspectives. That means their opinions or their beliefs in faith or religion differed. As a result of that, it happened that he could not convince himself to share his birch. Birch is that log, that wood which he had got in his hand. He couldn't offer to keep the fire alive just because he found there was somebody sitting who did not belong to his religion, to the same beliefs, and therefore he couldn't convince himself to share his log. So we see in the third stanza how the poet has manifested that there is a discrimination prevalent in the society on the ground of differences of religion. So we move on to the third stanza now. The third one sat in tattered clothes. He gave his coat a hitch. Why should his log be put to use to warm the idle rich? Now here, in the third stanza, we see the class difference, the difference that exists in the society on the ground of rich and poor, the classes of rich and poor. We see that the third one was sitting there, he was in tattered clothes, and tattered means he was wearing worn and torn clothes that seemed to be pathetic in its appearance. That means we can understand that the man must be feeling colder just because his clothes were already a bit torn, due to which he gave his coat a hitch. That means he tried to bring his coat closer to his body, closer to his himself, and this is how he was probably trying to cover himself even more properly. Why should his log be put to use? And he was thinking, why should I be giving my log to such a fire that would help even the person who is rich in this group. And he couldn't convince himself to help the rich person just because he used to keep the perspective that rich people are idle and they always try and take advantage of the poor and they do not want to work. So, this is the perspective of a poor person towards a rich person, and due to which there prevails you can say, such a thought that they cannot like each other, they do not respect each other. A poor person can never convince himself to help a rich person, and a rich person can never convince himself to understand the situation of the poor person. So, this is how we come to an end of the third stanza. The rich man just sat back and thought of the wealth he had in store and how to give what he had earned from the lazy, shiftless poor. And then came the turn of the rich man, and he simply sat back in a relaxed way and thought that he had accumulated wealth with a lot of efforts and he hadn't done that so as to help a poor person. So he decided that if he helps a poor person today just by giving his log, because he was thinking that there is a poor person as well sitting in this group. So if I give my log to this fire to keep it alive, then this log of mine will also help this poor person. And this poor person is such a person that means all the poor people are of such temperament according to the rich people, that these poor people always rely on the rich people to feed themselves and to help themselves. And that's why this rich man decided not to help the poor person by offering his log to the fire. So he thought that he should keep his hard earned wealth only to himself, and he must not help that lazy, sluggish, shiftless poor who always depend on the rich for feeding themselves, for any kind of a help that they need. So, this is how we move on to the second stanza now. That is the next one. The black man's face bespoke revenge as the fire passed from his sight, for all he knew in his stick of wood was a chance to spite the white. So we see here how it has come around. The turn had started from the white lady, and now it has come to the black person. And the black person seems to be waiting for his chance for a long time, because he has become vindictive by this time. In the meantime, what is vindictive? To be vindictive is to get filled with the feeling of taking revenge, कि बस मौका मिले और सारे बदले ले लें. When you have that feeling in yourself to take revenge, it is called you have become vindictive. So, this black person had become vindictive and he was waiting for an opportunity to take revenge. And this could be seen from his expressions on his face itself. That's why when his turn came and he saw the fire in front of himself, he saw his stick of wood that he had got in his hand, and he found it a kind of a tool or a device or an instrument to take revenge, as it was a high time or the best time that he had got to take revenge, and he couldn't miss the opportunity. That's why he simply took the opportunity, and he wanted to spite the white. That means he wanted to take revenge from the white, and that's what he did by refusing to give his log to the fire. And then comes the next stanza, that is, the last man of this forlorn group did not accept for gain, giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. So here came the turn of the last man of this forlorn group. Here in this line there is a figure of speech called oxymoron. Let us understand this figure of speech oxymoron. Actually, whenever there are two words that are completely contrary in meaning to each other, but they come together, that is called oxymoron. For example, forlorn group. Here, Forlorn means lonely, and group means when there are few people together, more than one person. Right. So here we see that forlorn group. If we are talking about a group, there must be more than one or two people. Then how can we say that the group is alone or lonely? A group can never be lonely because in a group there are more than one or two persons. So forlorn group are two such words that are completely contrary in meaning to each other, and that is why if they come together, it is a figure of speech called oxymoron. So, the last man of this forlorn group. Why is it said here that the group is forlorn? Just because although they are sitting in a group, they are so alone because they are completely selfish and so cruel, so harsh, not at all ready to help each other. So, what is the use of being together? This is how the poet is showing you our society metaphorically, that we are also like this, so selfish and so harsh and so cruel. Then, what is the use of being together in the society? It is called that we are like social animals. So, how are we living in a society as a social being when we are not at all present to help our fellow being? So, here it happens that the last man in that lonely group, he had this idea that he would not do anything except for his gain or profit. Did not means he did nothing. Except for gain means he used to do things only for the sake of some profit. If he is getting something in return, then only he used to do things. Giving only to those who gave was how he played the game. That means his idea to play the game was that he would help only to those who would help him in return. So, since he hadn't got any help from anybody, and every one of them had thus far refused to offer their log, now it was his turn, so he should also refuse. Why? Because he couldn't get help from anybody of them. Then why should he offer help to them? That was his perspective. So, here this man is actually representing the selfishness that is prevalent in the society, that is rather gaining, that is increasing at a very fast rate. Even in the contemporary world, we see that people now tend to become more and more selfish. So here this man is representing the negative emotions or selfishness, you can say. And then let us come on to the last stanza. Their locks held tight in death's still hands was proof of human sin. They did not die from the cold without, they died from the cold within. Here again, you see that in this last stanza, the first line, there is a figure of speech called personification. Here, this death has been personified just because we see that it is said death's still hands. So, death has got the hands, and this is how it has been treated as a person. It has been given the characteristic of a person. That means it has been treated as a person. So, it is personified, and there is a figure of speech called personification. So, now all of them die. Why? Just because the fire had died, fire had extinguished. They hadn't given their logs, and due to that, the fire extinguished. And when the fire extinguished, they could not survive in the low temperature. The temperature was very low, and they were feeling very cold, and they couldn't survive. Right? So when they died, you see their picture, you imagine their picture that they all were sitting with the logs in their hands. And that picture has been described here by the poet, that they held tight in death's still hands, as if the death itself had held those logs in its hands. Why? Because they had died because of their own emotions, because of their own feelings of negativity, hatred, selfishness, jealousy, and lack of humanity. That's why it was such a great proof of human sin, that there is no humanity left in the world, that they were so selfish and so much hateful towards each other that they refused to help the other person. Instead of choosing to help the other person, although they knew that they would die as well. So what they chose was not to help their fellow beings, rather they chose to die. This is a great proof of human sin. And the last two lines of this poem are very, very important. You should learn them by heart. They did not die from the cold without, they died from the cold within. That means when you see them dead with the logs in their hands, you come to the conclusion that they have not died due to the low temperature outside, but due to the hatred in their hearts. Although, if they're if the doctors are supposed to declare the reason behind their deaths, then they will say that they have died due to the cold outside. The temperature was very low and they could not survive in that temperature. But according to the poet, it is not the cold outside that has killed them, but it is their own cold inside their hearts, that is, in the form of hatred, negativity, selfishness, that has killed them. And that is why they themselves are responsible for their deaths, for their such a result, such a situation. That means whatever they suffered from, it was due to their own activity. It is their own deeds that has shown them this death. So we come to this conclusion that we should see this poem from the perspective of the poet and try to metaphorically see our society at a wider level that has been going in the same direction, where everyone is so selfish, is getting so negative and so hateful towards their fellow beings that they actively participate in harming the other person without thinking about their own selves, that very often they themselves also get victimized of their own negativity, but they do not realize it. And by the time they realize, it gets too late, and they also become the victim as well as the sufferer. So we should try and learn from this poem that negativity and hatred can never help us, but would rather give us such an end. So it is better we choose to help others and try to gain and inculcate in ourselves the feeling of humanity. I hope you understood this poem. So now, in short, I'm just giving you the gist of each stanza. The first stanza was simply giving you the setting of the poem, where the poet is telling you that there are six humans that got trapped by chance in such a place where there was very cold and the temperature was very low. And each one of them had got a log in their hands. In the second stanza, the poet has described this to you, that at the same time they were able to keep themselves warm just because they had got a fireplace in between. They were sitting in a circle, and in the center they had got a fireplace. This is how they could keep themselves warm. But then the problem was that the fire was dying, it was extinguishing. But the good thing was that they all had got a log in their hands, with the help of which they could keep the fire alive and continue to get the warmth. But then it happened that there was a lady who was white in complexion, and she was the first one who should have offered her log, but then she refused to offer just because she found that in the circle there was a black person sitting, and she couldn't convince herself to help that black person due to that feeling of racism in her. Then in the third stanza, it was all about the discrimination on the ground of religion difference. Then in next stanza, it is describing you the discrimination on the ground of class difference, that is rich and poor. In another stanza, simultaneously, again the poet has shown you how there is a discrimination existing in the society on the ground of class difference, that is rich and poor. Then in another stanza, you see how the it had come around, and it was now the turn of the black person who had suffered from insult when that white lady refused to give her log just because of this black person. And that's why this black person had taken it to heart, and now he was looking for an opportunity to take revenge. So as soon as his turn came, he simply took the revenge by refusing to give his log to the fire. Then came another second last stanza, Second last stanza is simply giving you the face of that person who is representing selfishness in the society, as he says that he would never do anything for anybody unless he gets something in return out of his deed. So, on that ground, he refused to help by giving his log to the fire, and he also kept it to himself. This is how we see in the last stanza they all died just because there was very cold there, and the fire was already about to die, so the fire had died by that time, and they hadn't given their logs, so they had their logs in their hands, and they died with their logs in their hands itself. And this is how it was giving a picture of a great human sin, that there was so much lack of humanity and love and positivity in them that they died just because of their hatred and negativity and all. So we see and come to this conclusion in the perspective of the poet that they had not died due to the low temperature outside. Nature hadn't caused death to them, but they themselves had caused their deaths just by being so rude, so harsh, so selfish, and so negative towards their fellow beings. So they did not die from the cold without. Without means outside, but they died from the cold within. That means they died due to the hatred inside their hearts. So this is how we come to an end of this poem. I hope you understood this poem. Please tell me in the comment section, comment box, whether you understood the poem or not. Thank you for watching.